The bus rolled to a slow stop on the edge of town, its brakes hissing like an exhausted beast. Dust rose in a soft cloud around the wheels, coating the faded benches and cracked sidewalks. The town hadn't changed much, not in the years she had been gone, not in the months of silence when home felt like a memory. She could still see the familiar neon diner sign flickering across the street, still hear the faint creak of the old water tower in the wind. And yet, everything felt foreign. Or maybe it was her who had become a stranger. She stood as the bus door groaned open, her boots thudding against the worn rubber mats. The uniform felt heavy on her shoulders, the fabric rough from too many washes, the patches frayed at the edges. But she wore it with a quiet pride, even as she adjusted her duffel bag on her arm and stepped onto the cracked pavement. The town was small enough that people noticed immediately. A few heads turned from parked trucks. Old men at the barbershop window paused mid-conversation, and even the gas station attendant leaned against his pump to get a better look. It wasn't every day someone came home in uniform. Not here, not anymore. She straightened her back and kept her pace steady, though her heart beat with a faint hum of nerves. War had taught her how to hide its fear, pain, hesitation. She had learned to lock those emotions away behind her eyes, where no one could reach them. But returning here was different. The battlefield was straightforward. You knew where the bullets came from, where the danger lay. Here, the looks people gave her carried a different kind of weight curiosity mixed with judgment, respect tangled with suspicion. The diner door shingled as she pushed it open. The scent of frying bacon and strong coffee hit her immediately, a memory that almost made her chest ache. It was the same diner she used to visit in high school, sitting in the corner booth with friends, laughing too loudly over milkshakes. That life seemed like it belonged to someone else, some girl she used to know before sand, blood, and fire reshaped her into who she was now. Inside, conversations paused. Forks clinked softly against plates before stilling. She felt the silence press against her back as she walked to the counter. The sound of her boots on the old linoleum floor was louder than it should have been, echoing in the tense quiet. "Coffee," she said simply when the waitress approached, her voice calm but low. The waitress, a woman in her 40s with tired eyes, nodded quickly and poured the steaming liquid into a chipped white mug. She set it down with a faint smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "On the house," the waitress whispered, almost conspiratorial, before walking away. She wrapped her hands around the mug, feeling the warmth seep into her palms. For a moment, it was grounding. For a moment, she allowed herself to breathe. But the weight of eyes on her never lifted. From the corner table, a group of men watched her. She recognized the type instantly: ball caps, work boots, the kind of confidence that grew louder in groups. They whispered among themselves, their laughter carrying across the diner like static. She didn't turn her head, didn't acknowledge them. She had faced worse stares under the scope of an enemy rifle. Still, she could feel the hostility sharpen in the air. One of them muttered something too low for her to catch, and the others snickered. She kept sipping her coffee, steady, calm. Her mind wandered, unbidden, to the desert nights. To the time she had sat in the dirt with a tin mug, sipping bitter coffee from a mess kit, trying to stay awake through the long watch. The smell of diesel in the air, the hum of generators, the distant crack of gunfire. Coffee meant survival. Coffee meant staying alert when everything depended on it. Here, it was just coffee. And yet, her grip on the mug tightened slightly, the past bleeding into the present. The men's voices grew louder, their laughter no longer disguised as whispers. She closed her eyes briefly, letting the sounds of the diner wash over her. The clatter of dishes, the faint hum of a jukebox in the corner, the hiss of grease from the kitchen. Ordinary sounds. Normal life. She had missed this. But now, Even this normalcy felt like a test, a battlefield dressed in checkered tablecloths and neon lights. When she opened her eyes, she caught the reflection of the men in the diner's front window. They weren't just watching her, they were daring her to notice them. One leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, a smirk playing on his lips. Another nudged his friend, nodding in her direction. She had seen this look before, not in war, but in places where people underestimated her, places where strength was measured in loudness rather than endurance. She took another sip of coffee, her face betraying nothing. The door to the diner opened behind her, letting in a gust of cool air. More eyes turned her way, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she straightened her posture, the way she had been trained to do during inspections. She wasn't here to prove anything, yet every second felt like a trial she hadn't asked for. For a moment, she wondered if coming in uniform had been a mistake. She could have changed into civilian clothes before stepping off the bus. She could have avoided the stares, the whispers, the judgment. But then again, why should she hide? She had earned this uniform, every patch, every scar, every thread. It wasn't a costume, it was her truth. Her eyes drifted to the photograph wall by the counter. Old black and white portraits of town veterans hung their faces young and old, captured in uniforms from wars long past. Some were smiling, some stoic, some already shadows by the time the photos were framed. She wondered how many of them had been doubted too. How many had walked into this same diner and faced the same silence. The waitress returned briefly, setting down a plate of pie she hadn't ordered. "Figured you could use something sweet," the woman said softly. She nodded in thanks, but didn't touch it. The coffee was enough. The men in the corner chuckled again, louder this time. One slapped the table, making his fork rattle. She didn't move. She didn't need to not yet. The quiet dignity of her stillness was louder than their jeers. But dignity has a way of provoking the insecure, and she could already sense where this was heading. Her spoon stirred the coffee slowly, the swirl of liquid a calm rhythm against the rising storm. She wasn't afraid. She had been afraid once, long ago, but fear was something she had learned to master, something she had packed away with the desert sand and the sound of helicopters in the night. Here, she wasn't facing bullets. Here, she was facing ignorance. And ignorance, she knew, could be just as cruel. The diner clock ticked loudly above her, each second stretching longer than it should. She took another sip. The storm hadn't arrived yet, but she felt its shadow already pressing against her back. And when it came, she knew she would be ready. The first insult carried across the diner like a stone skipping across water. "You don't belong in that uniform," one of the men said, his voice sharp with mockery. It wasn't loud, but it was enough. The words were designed to cut, meant to pierce her composure. She kept her eyes on the steam rising from her coffee, pretending not to hear. Silence was sometimes the best weapon. She had learned that overseas. A soldier who reacts too quickly gives away power. But silence also provokes, and the men seemed eager for a reaction. The one in the ball cap leaned forward on his elbows, his grin spreading wider. "Hey, sweetheart. I'm talking to you." The waitress froze mid-step, tray balanced on one hand. A man at the counter lowered his newspaper, his eyes flicking nervously between the soldier and the group. Nobody spoke. The diner seemed to hold its breath. She didn't turn her head. Instead, she lifted her mug, took a slow sip, and set it down again with calm precision. She had faced artillery shells and snipers. She wasn't about to be rattled by cowards, armed with cheap beer and overblown egos. But the men weren't satisfied with her silence. "You wear that thing like you earned it," another said, his tone dripping with disdain. "Bet you never even left the base. Just wanted the attention, huh? Dress up for the folks back home?" Laughter erupted at their table, harsh and grating, shattering the fragile peace of the room. Her grip on the mug tightened, the ceramic warm against her skin. She could feel the other patrons shifting uncomfortably, torn between wanting to intervene and wanting to stay out of it. That was always the way in small towns. Everyone knew everyone, but no one wanted to be the one to step into the fire. Her silence stretched on, deliberate. But the men mistook it for weakness. "Go on," the man in the cap said, his grin now sharp with cruelty. "Prove it. Show us. Take off the jacket. Let's see if you've really earned those patches, or if you're just some poser who likes to play soldier." The words hit the room like a slap. Someone at the counter coughed awkwardly, while the waitress muttered a soft, "Don't," under her breath. But the men ignored everyone else. Their focus was entirely on her, their laughter bubbling like poison in the air. She raised her eyes for the first time, meeting their stares head-on. Her gaze was steady, cold, the kind of look that had made grown men freeze on battlefields. For a split second, one of them faltered, his grin wavering. But peer pressure was a powerful force, and he quickly masked it with another laugh. "Well?" the man demanded, louder this time. "Take it off, or admit you're nothing but a fraud." Her pulse was steady, her breath controlled. She remembered standing under the blazing sun in a faraway land, hearing men scream at her in a language she didn't understand, bullets cracking through the air. She had survived all of that. And yet, here in her own town, she found herself cornered by the very people she had once fought to protect. The irony wasn't lost on her. She slowly pushed her chair back, the screech of wood against linoleum slicing through the diner's silence. Every head turned. The men leaned forward eagerly, expecting a meltdown, maybe even a retreat. She stood tall, her shadow stretching long in the overhead light, her uniform catching the glint of the neon sign through the window. The waitress whispered sharply, "You don't need to do this." But the soldier simply offered her the faintest nod, calm and unshaken. "Take it off." The man in the cap repeated, his voice almost triumphant, as if victory were already his. Her fingers moved to the buttons of her jacket. Slowly, deliberately, she began unfastening them one by one. The room was so quiet that the faint click of each button sliding free was almost deafening. The men chuckled, exchanging smug looks. To them, this was humiliation. Proof that they had stripped her dignity, exposed her as an imposter. But to everyone else watching, there was something in her stillness, something in her measured movements that suggested otherwise. She slid the jacket open, shrugging it off her shoulders. Beneath, the fabric of her undershirt clung to her frame, a faint outline of muscles built from years of training and survival. And then came the tattoo. Bold and unflinching, the ink sprawled across her shoulder and upper arm. Dark lines etched in permanent defiance, forming the insignia of a unit, whispered about even among soldiers. It was not a common mark, not one given freely. It was the kind of tattoo you didn't earn unless you had stared death in the face and walked away with scars. The diner gasped collectively. Forks clattered against plates. Even the jukebox seemed to falter mid-song. The men froze. Their smirks evaporated. Eyes widened, jaws slackened. The room was suffused with a silence so profound it felt like the aftermath of an explosion, the moment when dust hangs heavy in the air, and no one dares breathe. They knew the symbol. Even civilians had heard whisper stories of missions buried in classified files, of soldiers who returned with shadows in their eyes and silence in their hearts. That tattoo was more than ink. It was a testament, a graveyard, a legacy carved into skin. Her gaze swept over them, steady and unflinching. She said nothing. She didn't need to. The tattoo spoke louder than words. It said, "I have been where you would never survive." I have carried burdens you could never bear. I have earned every thread of this uniform with blood you will never spill. One of the men shifted uncomfortably, his bravado crumbling. Another lowered his eyes to the table, unable to meet her stare. Their earlier laughter seemed pitiful now, like the yapping of dogs silenced by the presence of a wolf. Still, she didn't gloat. She didn't raise her voice. She stood in calm defiance, letting the weight of her truth crush them without a single word. The waitress, who had been watching with wide eyes, finally exhaled. The sound seemed to break the spell, but the silence lingered, heavy and suffocating. The men had demanded proof, and she had given it. But it wasn't the proof they had wanted. It was something far more dangerous, a mirror to their own cowardice, their own ignorance. She bent down, picked up her jacket, and draped it back over her shoulders. Each button clicked shut like the closing of a door, final and resolute. The uniform that had been mocked only moments ago now hung on her like armor, untouchable, revered. The men said nothing. Their voices, so loud and arrogant before, had abandoned them. They sat in silence, trapped in the gravity of what they had seen. She returned to her coffee, calm as ever. She didn't glance back at them, didn't seek validation. She had nothing to prove. Not anymore. And yet, in the quiet corners of the diner, respect had blossomed, quiet, unspoken, but undeniable. The confrontation was over, but its echo would linger long after she walked out the door. The silence inside the diner was a fragile thing, stretched so thin that even the faintest sound seemed like a thunderclap. Somewhere in the kitchen, a pan sizzled. Outside, a truck rumbled past on the street. But inside those walls, every person, every breath, every thought was locked on her. She stood beside her chair, tall and unmoving, the faint hum of the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Her coffee sat cooling on the counter, forgotten, a thin curl of steam rising into the tense air. The men who had challenged her leaned back in their seats, expecting to see her flustered, exposed, stripped of dignity. That was the game. They wanted to reduce her to nothing with their jeers. But she didn't play games. Not in war, not now. Her training rose up inside her like muscle memory. Years of discipline, of knowing when to move and when to wait, when to speak and when silence was sharper than steel. In the field, hesitation could mean death. Here, hesitation meant surrendering her ground to men who thrived on weakness. She was not weak. Her hands went to the jacket again, but this time the motion was deliberate, controlled, like a ritual. Each button slid free with an audible click. She could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on her, pressing against her like the heat of desert sun. Each breath came slow and steady, the rhythm of a soldier on patrol. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of rushing, of looking rattled. Her stillness became its own defiance. For a heartbeat, the room seemed to forget the insult, the demand. All they could see was her calm precision. The way she held herself spoke louder than arguments or shouts. There was no fear in her, no shame, only a deliberate choice. She would let her truth be seen, not on their terms, but on hers. The men shifted uneasily. Their laughter had died out long ago, replaced by a tension they hadn't anticipated. It was as though they had prodded at something they didn't understand, and now they weren't sure what would happen if it woke fully. Her jacket slipped from her shoulders, heavy with sweat, dirt, and memories. It fell against the back of the chair with a soft thud. Beneath it, the plain undershirt revealed the strength of her frame, the years of carrying packs, of climbing mountains, of running into fire when others ran away. She didn't flex, didn't posture, she simply was, and that quiet power unsettled them more than any shouting match could. But what held the room was not her muscle, not the scars faintly visible against her skin. It was what came next. The tattoo. As she turned slightly to place her jacket neatly on the chair, the ink came into view. Black lines, sharp and unmistakable, etched across her shoulder and upper arm. The insignia of a special forces unit that most civilians had never heard spoken aloud, but whose legends traveled in hushed whispers through military towns. A mark not given freely, but earned in blood and shadow. Someone at the counter inhaled sharply. The sound snapped through the air like a whip. The men froze. One of them, the loudest, leaned forward instinctively, squinting as though his eyes might deceive him. Recognition dawned in his expression, followed swiftly by disbelief. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. They knew, or at least they knew enough. Civilians might see just ink, but even they had heard the stories of soldiers sent on missions that officially didn't exist, of units that entered the most hostile corners of the world and left without leaving a trace. Whispers of raids, rescues, ambushes survived by few. To carry that symbol meant more than bravery. It meant survival against odds so merciless they couldn't be measured. The soldier did not move, did not speak. She let the tattoo do the talking. Her eyes swept the room once, steady and cool. She wasn't angry. She wasn't proud. She was simply resolute. The tattoo was not for display. It wasn't a trophy or a boast. It was memory carved into flesh, a reminder she carried because she could never forget. And now, whether she wanted to or not, it had become her answer. A waitress set down a tray too quickly, the plates rattling together. The noise startled one of the men, who jumped slightly before trying to cover it with a nervous chuckle. The sound of it was hollow, brittle, falling flat in the heavy silence. Jesus, one of them muttered under his breath, though it wasn't clear if he meant it as a curse or a prayer. The soldier finally moved again, not to cover the tattoo, but to pick up her coffee. She lifted the mug, sipped calmly, and set it back down. Every motion was deliberate, unhurried, like the steady breathing of someone who had faced fire and survived. The power had shifted, though she hadn't spoken a single word. The men sat frozen in their seats, the bravado drained from their faces. Their earlier taunts hung in the air like smoke after a fire, acrid and bitter, impossible to take back. The others in the diner, the old man at the counter, the couple in the booth by the window watched quietly, their expressions unreadable. But the weight of what had just happened wasn't lost on anyone. Her defiance wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was steady, controlled, unshakable. The kind of defiance, or not of pride, but of necessity. She had faced down storms before. She had looked into the darkness and walked out of it alive. Compared to that, this was nothing. And yet, it was everything. Because here, in her own hometown, she shouldn't have had to prove herself. She shouldn't have needed to unbutton her jacket, to bear the scars and ink that told stories too heavy for words. She shouldn't have needed to remind anyone that the uniform wasn't a costume. It was her life, her sacrifice, her truth. She exhaled slowly, the faintest sigh, as though releasing the weight of their ignorance. One of the men opened his mouth, but no words came. His jaw clicked shut again. He stared at the tattoo, then at her eyes, then away. The balance of power had shifted, and everyone in the diner felt it. She reached for her jacket again, not hurriedly, but with calm precision. Draping it across her arm, she left the tattoo uncovered just long enough for the image to sear itself into the memory of those who had doubted her. Not a boast, not a threat, a truth undeniable and eternal. The soldier had chosen silence over argument, composure over rage. And in doing so, she had won a battle no one would forget. The air in the diner shifted the instant the tattoo was exposed. For a moment, no one moved. No one even breathed. The world outside went on as usual. A truck engine humming past, wind rustling against the glass, but inside, everything froze. The bold black lines etched into her skin seemed to radiate more power than any words could. The insignia was unmistakable. It wasn't decorative, wasn't fashionable. It carried a weight, an unspoken truth that needed no explanation. To the uninitiated, it might have seemed like just another military symbol. But to those who knew, and even to those who had only heard rumors, it was something more. A mark of blood, shadow, and survival. The men who had been jeering moments earlier sat in stunned silence. Their smirks had vanished. Their laughter, so loud and grating, now seemed like a memory they wished they could erase. The soldier's shoulder carried the proof of something they feared, that the stories whispered in bars and passed down among veterans weren't myths at all. She was standing in front of them. The waitress was the first to move, her hands trembling as she set down a glass of water on the counter. She didn't look at the soldier directly, but her eyes flickered to the tattoo and then away, as if staring at it too long might burn her. The old man at the counter leaned forward, squinting, his wrinkled hands tightening around his coffee mug. His silence wasn't disbelief, it was recognition. The soldier herself remained perfectly still, her face calm, her eyes steady. She didn't explain, didn't boast. The tattoo wasn't for them. It wasn't for anyone but her, and those she had left behind. But the ink carried stories, whether she wanted them told or not. In her mind, the diner walls dissolved. The clink of dishes and hiss of grease gave way to the distant roar of engines, the acrid sting of gunpowder in the air, the heavy weight of night vision goggles pressing against her face. She remembered the night she earned that mark. The mission had been simple on paper. Extraction. In reality, nothing about it had been simple. A village in hostile territory. Allies pinned down. Reinforcements hours away. Her unit had been dropped in under cover of darkness. Every step calculated. Every sound magnified in the suffocating silence. She could still see the faces of her team, painted with streaks of mud, eyes wide with focus. They had moved as one, shadows slipping through the broken streets, rifles raised, every heartbeat pounding with the knowledge that discovery meant death. And then, chaos. Gunfire shattered the night, tracer rounds slicing through the air like fireflies of death. Screams erupted. Dust choked her lungs as walls crumbled. They pushed forward anyway, dragging wounded comrades, holding the line until their extraction arrived. Hours stretched into eternity, every second a gamble. She remembered the moment her friend, barely 20, younger than she was, had fallen. She remembered dragging him out of the line of fire, her body screaming with exhaustion, but her will refusing to break. She remembered the blood, sticky and warm on her hands, staining her uniform, soaking into her skin. When it was over, they had survived, but not all of them. The tattoo came later, inked in silence during the weeks that followed, a symbol for those who had made it through and a memorial for those who hadn't. It wasn't about pride. It was about remembrance. About carrying the weight of what they had endured together. Every line of the design had meaning. The sharp edges represented the danger they had walked through. The shadowed curves symbolized the silence they carried afterward, the missions that could never be spoken of. And at the center, the mark of the unit itself, feared by enemies and respected by allies. It wasn't art, it was survival carved into flesh. Back in the diner, her eyes blinked once, steady, returning to the present. The men had gone pale. They avoided her gaze, staring into their plates as if the answers to their shame might be written in the crumbs of their sandwiches. The boldest of them shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his jaw clenched tight, his hands fidgeting with his napkin. "You," he began, his voice hoarse, then trailed off. There was nothing he could say. The soldier didn't respond. She didn't need to. The old man at the counter cleared his throat, breaking the silence. His voice was gravelly, weighted with years. "Haven't seen that mark in a long time," he said softly, almost reverently. He didn't ask where she got it, didn't press for details. He simply nodded once, slowly, his eyes meeting hers with the quiet understanding of someone who had once walked a similar road. The waitress, still shaken, moved carefully around the room, but the way she placed dishes down had changed. There was no pity in her movements now, only respect. The soldier's tattoo had shifted the entire balance of the room. The men who had mocked her moments before now looked small, their arrogance exposed as cowardice. They had demanded proof, but what they had received was more than they could handle. Proof not just of her service, but of the horror she had endured, the kind they could never imagine. She took another sip of her coffee, unbothered by their silence. In her world, silence was often the loudest sound of all. Her thoughts drifted again, this time not to missions or firefights, but to the weight of coming home. It wasn't the first time someone had questioned her service. It wasn't the first time someone had doubted her, had tried to reduce her to a stereotype or a joke. But every time it happened, it cut deeper than any wound she'd taken in combat. Bullets and bombs were impersonal. They didn't care who you were. But mockery from your own people, from the very ones you had protected, was a wound that healed slower, if it healed at all. She knew the tattoo frightened them. It wasn't just what it represented, it was what it forced them to confront about themselves. They had spent their lives in safety, cushioned by the sacrifices of others. Seeing her mark reminded them that safety wasn't free, that someone had paid for it, and sometimes that someone didn't come home. That was why they froze. That was why they feared it. Because it was easier to mock a uniform than to acknowledge the truth behind it. Minutes passed. The diner slowly resumed its rhythm, though the air was still heavy with unspoken tension. Forks scraped plates, cups clinked softly, but the usual chatter was gone. No one wanted to break the fragile silence with words too clumsy to fit the moment. The soldier finally slid her jacket back on, each button fastened with quiet finality, covering the tattoo once more. But it didn't matter that it was hidden again. The image was already burned into their memories, carved into the air of that small-town diner forever. She adjusted the collar, sat back down, and lifted her coffee again. To anyone else, it might have looked like nothing had happened. But to everyone in that room, everything had changed. The tattoo had spoken, and its voice was louder than all their laughter combined. The tattoo disappeared beneath the fabric of her uniform jacket, but the silence it left behind clung to the room like smoke. It wasn't the quiet of comfort, not the kind you found on porches at dusk, nor the kind that filled a home when loved ones sat together in peace. This silence was jagged. It cut. It made people shift in their seats, clear their throats, and fidget with spoons they didn't need. It pressed against the walls of the diner until even the hum of the neon sign outside seemed too loud. No one dared speak. The men who had demanded her proof sat stiffly, as if shackled by invisible chains. Just minutes ago, they had been loud, voices carrying, laughter sharp, hands slapping the table in cocky rhythm. Now, their plates sat abandoned, meals untouched. Their arrogance had been carved out of them in one brutal, wordless stroke. The boldest of them, a broad-shouldered man with a red baseball cap stained from sweat, tried to swallow, but the lump in his throat wouldn't go down. He gripped his coffee cup like it was an anchor, yet the tremor in his hand betrayed him. He dared a glance at the soldier, and the instant their eyes met, he dropped his gaze to the table, as though he had stared too long into the sun. The younger one beside him fared no better. His earlier sneer had drained from his face, leaving behind something pale, almost childlike. He toyed with the edge of his napkin, tearing it into little white shreds, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked painful. He wanted to say something, maybe an excuse, maybe an apology, but words caught in his throat, strangled by the weight of shame. Even the waitress, who had been moving briskly minutes before, slowed her steps. She set down plates with care, her eyes downcast, as though afraid to break whatever fragile barrier held the air in place. When she walked past the soldier's booth, she paused for the briefest second, her lips pressing together. She didn't speak, but her silence carried respect. The old man at the counter hadn't moved since he'd spoken. He sat with his coffee cooling in front of him, one weathered hand wrapped around the mug. His eyes remained fixed on the soldier, not in judgment, but in acknowledgement. He didn't need to ask questions. He knew enough. The soldier, meanwhile, sat perfectly still. She didn't gloat. She didn't offer explanation. She simply sat, sipping her coffee, her posture calm and steady. Her silence was not the silence of fear or shame. It was the silence of someone who had lived through enough storms that this moment was nothing more than passing weather. But to the others in the diner, it was not passing. It was transformative. Silence, she knew, was louder than noise. She had heard silences like this before. On the battlefield, silence often meant survival. The seconds between a burst of gunfire and the next ambush. The moments of waiting when every sense screamed at you to stay still. Silence could weigh more than the heaviest gear. And here, in this diner, it weighed just as much. Her mind flickered briefly to another silence. The silence after the tattoo had first been inked into her skin. She remembered lying on the chair in a dimly lit parlor overseas, the buzzing needle carving lines of fire into her shoulder. Her comrade sat beside her, his own arm already wrapped in bandages, a grim smile on his face. Neither of them had spoken much. Words weren't necessary. The silence between them had been one of respect, a pact made permanent in ink. This silence in the diner was different. It wasn't born from shared struggle. It was born from realization. The realization that these men, who had mocked her, had just glimpsed a world they could never enter. And that glimpse had shaken them to their core. The red-capped man finally shifted in his seat. His chair scraped the linoleum floor, a sharp screech that made several people flinch. He opened his mouth, closed it, then opened it again. "I didn't?" He began, his voice unsteady. His sentence crumbled halfway through. He lowered his eyes, gripping his fork but not lifting it. The soldier didn't look at him. She stirred her coffee, the spoon clinking gently against the ceramic mug. Her silence was answer enough. The younger one muttered something under his breath, too soft to catch, but the shame in his tone was clear. He had built his pride on mocking what he didn't understand, and now that foundation had collapsed. For the first time, the men looked small. Outside, a gust of wind rattled the glass, and a truck horn blared in the distance. The sounds felt foreign against the stillness of the diner. The world was moving, but inside, time seemed suspended. The soldier glanced toward the window, her gaze distant. She wasn't thinking of them, not anymore. She was thinking of those who couldn't come home, of the names carved into stone monuments, of the ghosts that walked silently behind her wherever she went. That tattoo wasn't for these men to understand. It wasn't for recognition, wasn't for validation. It was for memory. And memory, she knew, was often met with silence. Slowly, the old man at the counter broke the stillness again. "People don't understand," he said quietly, his voice carrying just enough to reach the ears that needed to hear it. He didn't look at the soldier this time. He looked straight ahead, his gaze fixed on something only he could see. "They think it's just a uniform, just a job. But it ain't. It never was." His words lingered in the air like smoke. The men shifted, uncomfortable under the truth. The waitress paused in her work again, her hands tightening around the coffee pot. The soldier gave a small nod. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The silence stretched on, but it was no longer the silence of humiliation alone. It was the silence of recognition, of heavy truths settling into the bones of those who had denied them before. By the time the clock above the counter ticked another 10 minutes forward, the atmosphere had changed completely. The mocking energy had died, replaced by something quieter, heavier. Respect, perhaps. Or maybe just the kind of fear that came when people realized their own fragility. The soldier set down her cup and reached for her wallet. The faint sound of bills sliding onto the table broke the quiet more than words ever could. She rose from her seat, her movements measured, deliberate. As she walked toward the door, the entire room seemed to hold its breath again. Not a single voice rose to stop her. Not a single laugh followed her steps. The doorbell chimed when she pushed it open. Cool air spilled inside, cutting through the heavy warmth of the diner. And then, just like that, she was gone. The silence remained. Long after her footsteps faded, long after the door swung shut, the people inside sat with the weight of what they had seen. They would carry it with them, maybe for days, maybe forever. Because silence has a way of sticking. And in that diner, on that day, silence told the loudest story of all. The cool air outside the diner wrapped around her as the door closed behind her. For a moment, she just stood there on the sidewalk, letting the silence of the town wash over her. The chatter of the diner was gone. The humiliation, the confrontation, all of it belonged to the room she had just left. Out here, the world felt different, lighter, yet the weight on her shoulders remained, because the weight had nothing to do with them. It was the past. Every step she took down the cracked sidewalk echoed with ghosts only she could hear. The buildings around her, faded brick, flaking paint, neon signs humming in windows, seemed distant, almost unreal. She'd been back in the States for months, but the country still felt foreign to her. Too quiet, too safe. And yet, inside her mind, the war hadn't ended. It rarely does for those who fight it. The weight first settled on her years ago, during her first deployment. She had been barely 21, still carrying the fresh determination of someone who thought service was about medals and honor. She remembered the plane ride over, the noise of boots stomping, soldiers joking too loudly to hide their nerves, the dull hum of engines beneath the floor. She remembered telling herself she was ready. But nothing prepared her for the moment reality arrived. Her unit had been sent to a remote valley, tasked with securing a route that insurgents used to move weapons. It was supposed to be routine. Instead, it became the first time she understood what war truly meant. She could still hear the sound of mortar raining down, the shriek in the air before impact, the earth exploding around them. The ground shook beneath her, and her ears rang for hours afterward. She could still feel the grit of dirt in her mouth, the burn of shrapnel grazing her leg, the shouts of men and women around her as chaos swallowed them whole. That day left no physical scar, but it planted the first weight inside her, the knowledge that war wasn't glorious. It was survival. Nothing more. Years later, the weight grew heavier. There had been another mission, the one that gave birth to the tattoo. She remembered every detail, no matter how much she wanted to forget. A rescue operation deep in hostile territory. Their orders were clear. Get in, extract the trapped team, and get out. But plans rarely survive contact with reality. She could still see the smoke rising from the buildings as they approached under cover of night. Still hear the gunfire erupting without warning. Still feel the sweat dripping down her spine beneath her gear as her squad scrambled into position. She had carried one of the wounded out herself, his blood soaking her sleeves as she dragged him through the dirt. She remembered the sound of bullets whipping past her ears, the way time slowed to a crawl in those moments. Her muscles burned, lungs screaming for air, But she hadn't stopped. Couldn't stop. They'd made it back, most of them. But not all. It was in the silence that followed, the quiet of the safe house days later, the absence of voices that would never speak again, that the tattoo was born. Not as a badge of pride, but as a marker of loss. Each line, each symbol carved into her skin, was a gravestone for someone who never returned. That weight never lifted. Not once. On the streets of her hometown, she passed people who carried their own burdens, but nothing like hers. A mother pushing a stroller. A pair of teenagers laughing too loudly, their voices breaking in youthful tones. An old man leaning on his cane, moving slowly toward the drugstore. Normal lives. Safe lives. They had no idea. No idea what it felt like to stand in the middle of a firefight, wondering if this breath would be your last. No idea what it meant to hold a comrade's hand as their life drained away, whispering lies of reassurance you didn't believe. No idea what it meant to come home and look perfectly fine on the outside, while carrying a battlefield inside your head. That was the cruelest weight of all, invisibility. People saw her uniform and made assumptions. Some assumed honor. Some assumed arrogance. Some, like the men in the diner, assumed weakness. None of them saw the truth. None of them saw the sleepless nights, the way loud noises still set her heart racing, the name she still whispered when no one was listening. They didn't see the tattoo for what it really was. A gravestone etched into skin. She stopped at a crosswalk, staring at the red light as cars rolled past. Her reflection in a shop window caught her eye. The uniform sharp and neat. The face calm and steady. But she barely recognized the woman looking back. She remembered the woman she had been before the war. Wide-eyed, quick to laugh, ready to prove herself. That woman was gone. Buried somewhere far away, beneath sand and smoke. The woman standing here now was someone else. Someone quieter. Someone heavier. The weight wasn't just in her memories. It was in her body, too. Old injuries that ached when it rained. Scars hidden beneath fabric. Sleepless nights that carved lines beneath her eyes. But most of all, the weight was in her heart. The guilt. The survivor's guilt that no therapy, no medal, no kind word could erase. The questions that haunted her every night. Why did she make it when others didn't? Why did she walk out of the fire when her brothers and sisters were left behind? There were no answers. Just silence. She reached the edge of town, where the buildings thinned and fields stretched out under a wide sky. The open air felt different here, less suffocating. She paused, staring out at the horizon. Her hand rose instinctively to her shoulder, fingers brushing against the fabric covering her tattoo. The ink burned in her memory, not in pain, but in permanence. It was part of her now, as much as the blood in her veins. The weight of the past would never leave. She knew that. You didn't come back from war and set it down like a heavy pack. You carried it forever. But maybe, she thought, weight wasn't only a burden. Maybe it was also a reminder. A reminder of those who had fallen. A reminder of what survival cost. A reminder that the silence she carried wasn't emptiness. It was memory. She let out a slow breath, eyes fixed on the endless stretch of land before her. The past was heavy. Always would be. But she was still standing. And for now, that was enough. The diner hadn't felt the same since she left. Inside, the silence clung to the walls long after the soldiers' footsteps faded. The men who had taunted her sat in their booth like statues, heads bowed, shoulders stiff, unable to reclaim the arrogance they had worn like armor. The waitress moved quietly, refilling cups with soft hands, as though afraid to disturb the fragile atmosphere. Even the clatter of forks seemed muted, like the building itself was unwilling to break the weight of what had passed. Power had shifted, not with words, not with fists, but with truth. The truth of a mark inked into skin. The truth of sacrifice too heavy to laugh at. The truth of a silence that spoke louder than any insult. Later that evening, the soldier walked through town with the same steady pace she always carried, unaware, or perhaps unwilling to acknowledge, the ripples she left behind. Her boots struck the pavement in rhythm, her jacket buttoned neatly over the tattoo that had silenced a room full of doubters. She did not walk faster, did not hold her head higher, but the air around her seemed different. People noticed. A man sweeping the steps of the hardware store looked up as she passed. He'd heard about what happened. Small towns spread stories faster than wildfire. His eyes lingered on her, a question forming on his lips, but instead of speaking, he simply nodded. Not a casual nod, but one that held weight, an acknowledgement she didn't ask for, but received nonetheless. At the grocery store, a woman paused while unloading bags from her car. She, too, had heard. She pulled her child a little closer, not out of fear, but out of a sudden awareness. The soldier wasn't just another uniform now. She was a reminder of battles fought far away, of lives protected here at home. The woman whispered something to her child, who looked at the soldier with wide eyes before waving shyly. The soldier gave the smallest of nods. She didn't need their recognition, but it came anyway. Back in the diner, the men's shame festered. The red-capped man stared into his coffee as though it might swallow him whole. He'd spent years puffing his chest in this town, always the loudest, always the one others followed in laughter. But now, he couldn't shake the image of the tattoo, couldn't silence the weight of what it meant. She really was one of them, the younger man muttered, voice low. The red-capped man clenched his jaw. I didn't know, he said, but the excuse sounded hollow, even to him. The old man at the counter finally spoke, his gravelly tone cutting through the air. That's the problem. You never know, but you still run your mouth. Shame flushed the younger man's face. For once, he had no comeback. The balance of power had shifted. The soldier hadn't needed to raise her voice, hadn't needed to defend herself with fists or words. Her truth had spoken for her, and in doing so, it had stripped the bullies of their authority, leaving them small in a way no argument could have. The next morning, the soldier went for a run. She always did, a habit from the military that stuck, even when everything else felt foreign. Her boots pounded the dirt road that circled the edge of town, her breath steady, her pace relentless. Running had always been her way of shaking loose the heaviness that clung to her. As she passed the farm, she noticed two men leaning against a fence, watching her. They weren't mocking. They weren't laughing. They just watched. One of them raised a hand, not a wave, but a sign of acknowledgement. She didn't slow, didn't stop, but the gesture stayed with her. Later that day, at the coffee shop downtown, a pair of teenagers whispered when she walked in. She ignored them, as she always did. But when she turned to leave, she caught one of them standing straighter, his eyes not mocking, but filled with something else, admiration. The shift was subtle, quiet, but undeniable. Respect, she knew, was never asked for. It was earned. And sometimes it was forced into recognition by truth too heavy to deny. The men in the diner had been humbled. The townspeople had begun to look differently at her uniform, not as a costume, but as a shield they never had to carry themselves. And though she didn't seek their approval, she understood the change. She had seen it before. On deployment, she'd watched new recruits treat veterans with skepticism until the first firefight shattered their illusions. Afterward, those same recruits couldn't meet the veterans' eyes without respect. The shift always came with the same quiet inevitability, truth revealed in the fire. And here, though the battlefield was far away, the truth of her tattoo had been its own kind of fire. But respect was not the same as peace. She knew the weight she carried would never leave. She knew that the town's shifting perception didn't erase the memories carved into her bones. What it did offer, however, was a small reprieve, the knowledge that perhaps, for once, she wouldn't have to prove herself again. The next time someone looked at her uniform, maybe they'd think twice before laughing. Maybe they'd remember the silence of that diner, the way a single tattoo had stopped arrogance cold. Maybe they'd realize that behind every uniform was a story they could never truly know. That evening, she returned to the diner, not because she wanted to, but because she refused to let it become a place of defeat. She sat at the same booth, ordered the same coffee, and waited. The red-capped man was there again, though his voice was quieter than usual. He glanced at her once, then looked away, his pride still wounded. The younger one avoided her completely, keeping his eyes on his plate. The waitress brought her coffee without being asked. This time, when she set it down, she offered the faintest of smiles. It wasn't much, but it was something. The soldier wrapped her hands around the mug, letting the warmth seep into her palms. Around her, the diner carried on. Forks clinked, conversations resumed. The silence that had once dominated was gone, replaced by something different. Not noise, not mockery, but balance. The shift was complete. Power no longer rested with those who mocked her. It rested with the truth she carried, the weight of her past, the ink on her skin that no one could erase. She hadn't demanded respect. She hadn't even asked for it. But in the end, it had settled around her anyway, as inevitable as the sunrise. Outside, the night deepened, stars pricking through the dark sky. She finished her coffee, stood, and left a bill on the table. As she walked out into the cool air, she didn't look back. She didn't need to. She knew the balance had changed. And though her ghost still walked beside her, though the weight of the past pressed heavy on her shoulders, she walked with the quiet strength of someone who had nothing left to prove. Because power wasn't in the uniform. It wasn't in the tattoo. It was in survival. And survival was hers. The night had fallen fully by the time she stepped out of the diner. Neon lights buzzed faintly, illuminating the cracked pavement and casting long shadows behind her. A gentle breeze swept across the street, rustling the leaves of the few trees lining the sidewalk. The air smelled faintly of gasoline, fresh bread from the bakery down the road, and the lingering scent of coffee from the diner. She paused for a moment, letting the sounds and smells of the town wash over her. The confrontation, the silence, the subtle shift in respect, all of it belonged to the past now. She carried it inside herself, yes, but it was done. Finished. Closed. The townspeople would talk about what happened, she knew. They would tell the story in hushed tones at the grocery store, at the barber shop, at school drop-offs and church meetings. Her name would be spoken not with mockery, but with caution, respect, maybe even a trace of awe. But that didn't matter to her. She hadn't acted for them. She had acted for herself. Her boots clicked against the sidewalk, the rhythm steady and deliberate. Each step was a reminder of everything she had survived, everything she had lost, and everything she had carried home with her. The past pressed against her like a familiar weight, and she welcomed it. Memories came unbidden, vivid and sharp. The night she earned the tattoo, the smoke and chaos of battlefields far away, the faces of comrades she could never forget, some alive, some gone. Their laughter, their fear, their courage, etched into her mind as clearly as the black lines on her shoulder. The ink had been a promise, a remembrance, a mark of survival, a silent story for those who could understand it, and a warning for those who couldn't. And tonight, it had spoken again. She hadn't shouted, hadn't demanded acknowledgement. She hadn't needed to. The men in the diner, the townspeople, even the strangers on the streets. They had seen it. They had felt it. And in their awareness, the world had shifted slightly, just enough for truth to prevail. Yet she didn't linger. She walked past the hardware store, where the man sweeping the steps gave a small nod. She returned it with a flick of her chin. It wasn't pride, not arrogance, just recognition of shared understanding. Survival and respect, sometimes, were communicated without words. The grocery store came next. The woman with the child waved subtly, whispering something the child didn't understand. The soldier didn't stop. She didn't acknowledge more than a glance. She had no need for praise or applause. She had no need for validation. She had already faced storms the likes of which this town could never know. And she had walked away unbroken. Her reflection caught in a storefront window. The uniform was neat, the jacket buttoned. She looked strong, composed, entirely in control. An image of authority and resilience. But the eyes told the truth the uniform could not hide. They held the weight of memory, the weight of loss, a weight of battles fought in silence, far from cheering crowds. A young man walking his dog past her, catching sight of her reflection. He froze briefly, recognizing something he couldn't name. Courage, strength, survival. He walked on, slightly taller, a little more aware of what some people carried unseen. The soldier didn't notice. She was focused on the road ahead. Beyond the edge of town, the fields opened up under the night sky. Stars pricked the darkness, cold and distant, but infinite. She paused at the fence line, one hand resting on the weathered wood, fingers brushing over splintered grain. The wind tugged at her hair, and she breathed in deeply. For a moment, the battlefield returned to her. The roar of engines, the crack of gunfire, the screaming of men and women she had vowed to protect. But then, slowly, she exhaled, letting the ghosts settle. Not vanish, not fully, but she could walk with them now, carrying them rather than being crushed by them. The tattoo beneath her jacket itched faintly in memory, a reminder that some marks were permanent. Some stories would always live under the skin. Some burdens would never fully lift. And yet, she could still walk. She turned, leaving the fence behind, stepping onto the dirt path that led out of town. Every footfall carried certainty. She didn't look back, though she could feel the echoes of the diner, the silent acknowledgement of a town forever changed by her presence. She didn't need to glance over her shoulder to know the balance had shifted. The men who had mocked her were smaller now, even in their own eyes. The town saw her differently, and for the first time in a long while, she felt a kind of peace. Not happiness, not relief. Those were luxuries she had left behind overseas. But balance, recognition, the quiet understanding that she had faced the impossible and had returned intact. The road stretched before her, empty except for the occasional chirp of insects and the whisper of the wind. Freedom, she realized, wasn't the absence of weight. It was the ability to carry it forward without faltering. She walked on. Somewhere down the road, a dog barked in the distance. A train whistle cut through the night air. A light flickered in a farmhouse window. The world continued, as it always had. But she moved through it differently now. Every shadow, every noise, every quiet corner carried awareness of what it meant to survive. And somewhere in the distance, the people of the town would remember her. Not just as a soldier in uniform, not just as the woman with the tattoo, but as someone who had carried truth in silence, defiance without shouting, and power without needing to prove it. That memory would linger, and she would keep walking. The moon rose higher, pale and steady, casting silver light over the fields. Her silhouette stretched long in its glow, a figure both solitary and unyielding. She could feel the weight of the past pressing on her, but it was no longer crushing. It was hers to bear, a testament to all she had survived and all she had yet to face. She knew she would not forget, and perhaps she didn't want to. The memories, the tattoo, the battles, they were proof that she had lived fully and fiercely. She walked until the town disappeared behind her, until the dark fields opened wide, until the stars above seemed close enough to touch. The road ahead was uncertain, the future uncharted, but she moved with confidence because she had walked through fire before and emerged whole. Her past was heavy, yes. Her losses were real, but she was still here. And for tonight, for this moment, that was enough.